I've got Gina, Neff, David Pym, and Maria. And we have got Adrian joining us online. But we can start with our speakers in the room. I will first ask them to briefly introduce themselves and maybe make some opening remarks to start with.
Morning, everyone. So my name is Maria Axente. I work for PwC UK, and for the last 5 years, I managed to invent my role, really. So I created a role that sits in the intersection of policy and ethics. Started with AI, but gradually I'm expanding to other technology that PwC develops and sells for our clients. And mainly my role is to guide ourselves as a company and our clients in how to make sense of ethics, what it is, how do we work with it, how do we align it with our business objectives, and how do we make sense in being able to operate. And very grateful to be here this morning and represent the industry, so please prepare your questions, no matter how uncomfortable they are. To bring you a bit of the lessons we have learned of doing this in the last 5 years for ourselves and for our clients. And I will start first with the term governance, which at first it sounded a bit alien to us as well, because we don't use this term governance much, especially in the world of technology. We use other terms like operating models, processes, operations, but not so much governance. And at the beginning of us looking into developing some blueprints for algorithmic or AI governance for us and for our clients, very quickly we realized that our clients do develop and use technology in certain ways. And while we can come up with a blueprint that accounts for the specific characteristic of self-learning algorithms, we have to account the way things are being done in very specific organizations, very specific industries. So the first provocation for me to you is like, think of governance in terms of process, of flows of steps that happen to achieve an outcome. It's not just about having the capabilities in place, it's how do you make it happen in practice, and how do you account the fact that companies are very complex systems with conflicting priorities sometimes. For them, algorithmic transparency, algorithmic governance is one of the multiple priorities they have to deal with. And what will be the incentives for them to prioritize? The second provocation is obviously engagement with industry. I'm here because I'm passionate about building bridges from industry to academia and research, but I'm keen to see bridges being built from the other side. And I work with Tech UK in my position as chair of data and AI leadership committees to be able to evangelize a different engagement to industry so that the best practices around governance are well understood and we're able to build on that. And my last provocation is, in terms of collaboration, we talk so much of collaboration, but the reality is industry doesn't know how to engage with academia, with policy, neither with the non-for-profit. So how do we help each other to learn how to collaborate and have an intentional collaboration that is not just for the sake of the goodwill, the good fill factor, but is intentional, and we are able to achieve some progress and we're able to communicate with that. Thank you so much. Pass it to Gina now.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Gina Neff. I'm director of the Menderoo Center for Technology and Democracy at the University of Cambridge, and I am professor of technology and society at Oxford, and that never causes me to mix those words up in situations like this. So I'm very grateful to be here today. Thank you, Zeynep, and thank you, Natalia, for helping to put this together, and thanks my colleagues at CSaP for bringing us here on such a lovely day. I am going to echo Maria's 3 provocations with 3 of my own. At this Menderoo Center for Technology and Democracy, we have a broad mandate to think about societal participation and capacity in our digital future. So how are we making decisions today that influence where society will go, who participates, who's invited to be a part of these conversations? So with that hat on, it's actually not my job to make algorithms better, right? I'm not in the business of fixing the tech. I'm not in the business of being there for engineers to help improve their systems. So that gives me a a little bit of a different role than someone like Maria, that is her first mandate. And thinking about that, and thinking as my background as a sociologist and a scholar of digital technologies and society, my first kind of provocation, echoing and dovetailing where Maria got us started, was to, this notion that if we think of governance as in terms of a process in practice, in context, I would say that the thing that is so clear from the research literature and from the work that I've been doing in this space is those always involve disciplinary boundaries, occupational boundaries, and organizational boundaries, right? So we're dealing with situations where when we get together in groups like this, we talk about something very broad, algorithmic governance, but on the ground and in practice, we're often talking about people who have very different responsibilities for different kinds of outcomes, for different kinds of products and services, for different kinds of sets of values. Those disciplinary boundaries become very clear very quickly. Occupational boundaries, who's owning ethics? What does an ethics owner look like within organizations? What does it mean to have people solving particular kinds of efficiency problems with systems when efficiency may not be the value that we're optimizing for or we want? And in terms of organizational boundaries, looking to some of the research that we've done, looking at these very long supply chains of inputs to make algorithmic systems often misses where decisions are made, where accountability is, and where those organizational lines are. They blur those organizational lines. So in that regard, with a team of four other scholars and practitioners in computer science and machine learning, we launched a book earlier this year with MIT Press on human-centered data science. The idea being, can we bring some of the knowledge that we have from about social science and ethics to the learners in this space of people who will be at the front lines of this? Is it going to be the solution for thinking about how we improve algorithmic governance? No. But are we going to be able to help train the next generation of people building, designing, deploying these systems to begin to have a practical and pragmatic purchase on what it is when groups like us come together and talk about algorithmic ethics and algorithmic governance? Can we actually translate that into engineering principles and practices? So that's kind of my first provocation, right? If we're going to move into, in terms of practice, in terms of process, and in terms of contexts, we really need to think about these notions of disciplines, occupations, and organizational boundaries. My second provocation is around trust. So trust in society is one of the key mandates we have at the Menderoo Center for Technology and Democracy. We take a very sanguine view in terms of the relationship between trust and technology. We don't presume that they influence one another. And again, that puts us at a little bit of odds of other kinds of organizations that may say, if we can only get the public to trust technology, then we can get better technologies. I think that's probably missing some of the key challenges that we're facing in terms of our social order at this moment. We see that trust in society is declining in general. That is something that predates our algorithmic moment. So that's a very potent moment for us to then reflect on and consider what we might be doing when we're building technological systems, right? So systems design and deployment has often said, how will we get people to trust this? One of the questions we might want to be thinking about is flipping that. What does it mean? What are we designing for people's trust in society today? Or what can we be designing to help support increased trust in society? So that's my second provocation. My third is really about social capacity. How are we building and expanding the capacity for people to be involved in holding these systems to account, holding the companies not only algorithms, but holding the companies that deploy and design large-scale data systems. How are we increasing the social capacity for people to be involved in those systems? So rather than, again, thinking, how do we bring people in to critique, or how do we bring people in to participate, what are we doing to make sure that we've got more people ready to be full participants, active, engaged citizens, humans involved in these systems? And that, I think, is one of the biggest challenges that we are facing. And with that, I will turn to David.
My name is David Pym. I'm Professor of Logic here at UCL. That means I hang out in both computer science and in philosophy. I also hang out at the University of London's Institute of Philosophy. And I do a few other things too. From the point of view of logic, I have thought about these sorts of questions a little bit, and in particular in the context of the governance of, in particular, derivatives trading. Now, in that world, the algorithmic governance of derivatives trading is very, very well developed. There are companies that do it and make an awful lot of money out of it, and it really works really well. So it's interesting to reflect on why that works really well. And it works really well for a number of reasons. Well, even though it's quite a complex problem, it's quite complex because these algorithms are operating across many jurisdictions, between many different institutions, many different banks and so on. So there's a lot of communication going on. And in any kind of distributed computing kind of setting, lots of things going on simultaneously tends to cause trouble. Right. Now, but it doesn't cause trouble there. It doesn't cause trouble there, mostly because it's a very constrained problem. It's very constrained by the regulatory frameworks within which these banks have to operate. They're expressed in relatively simple legal language. From a logician's point of view, legal language is pretty simple. It may be verbose, but it's pretty simple. It's pretty simple because it's basically a list of things that are included in some kind of proposition and things that are some kind of excluded in some kind of proposition. And you just go around checking that the thing you're doing satisfies these inclusions and these exclusions. And that actually works pretty well. It can be done pretty fast in real time, you know, for high frequency trading even. So, okay, so that works. But stepping back from that, what problems can we see? Well, in less tightly constrained regulatory contexts, where it's not as simply expressed as the rules governing what's a legal trade and so on, one can ask, what are the complex problems? Well, it's about lots and lots of ecosystems of systems having to communicate with one another. Right. It's not about a single algorithm making a single decision and having to be justified. It's not as simple as that. It's a whole collection of algorithms communicating with one another, feeding their outputs to the input of the next one, and you end up with a great big complex thing, which is the system you want to establish some trust in, some confidence in. So that's a hugely challenging problem. And it's one we're familiar with from dealing with great big computer systems these days. There's a lot of expertise around. But what there's not a level of expertise around in is expressing the requirements of that system and verifying that that system, that big ecosystem, is doing what it's supposed to do. And that's a very, very challenging problem. It's even worse in this world of algorithmic governance, and indeed, whichever way around you think of it, because the component systems of these great big ecosystems of systems are no longer doing things that are easy to specify. They're doing things which are almost intentionally obscure. Right. So, what is it when, what is it that some AI algorithm does when it makes a decision about somebody's creditworthiness? Right. Well, it's actually some kind of hill climbing algorithm in some optimization problem. But how does it make the decisions about what the optimality is? So we have to integrate these kind of social concerns, these social concerns of what constitutes optimality, what constitutes reliability, into our rigorous reasoning about what an algorithm is doing and how many such algorithms communicate with one another. So the nature of the problem has many, many different components to it, and most of them have unsolved challenges in them at this point. So it's really quite a fascinating question, which is good in many ways. Maybe we live in interesting times. In another part of my life, I work in security, in cybersecurity, and one of the things we've learned there is that when we formulate security policies, be they for governing a great big system or be they just for defining what your password is allowed to be or something, actually what determines what a good policy is has precious little to do with the technology and is mostly to do with the societal environment and the behavioral environment that technology lives inside. And we've learned that both to our cost and to our great advantage these days because we're now understanding how to deal with it. I think it's exactly that problem that we have to deal with in the world of governance. It's about the interface between the societal factors and what we might call the formal factors, the behavior of a program, the specification formally of what that program is supposed to do, rigorously at least, what that program is supposed to do, and how all those things interact with one another. So it's a great big interaction problem of a certain kind. I think I've probably taken enough time, given that we're certainly running late. So.
No, that's all right. Thank you so much. So we are now on to Adrian, to you, please.
It's a great pleasure to be with you. I'm sorry I'm not there in person, and sorry that you've got to strain your necks to turn around, and otherwise I'm in this peculiar spot. Particularly thanks, Zeynep, to you and Natalia for inviting me and for all the great work that you're doing. Sorry, I couldn't hear all the comments perfectly before, but to the extent I could, I think I was agreeing pretty much with all of them. I'm Program Director for AI at the Alan Turing Institute and also work in machine learning at Cambridge. One of the areas I really try to focus on is how we can try to help design, develop, and deploy trustworthy systems. So going beyond just trust, like Gina was talking about. I also worked previously in finance, so might be able to engage with David on the issues around financial derivatives if we want to go there, but you might not want to. I'm going to make just a few points. I think I'm going to say 4 things that I suggest we need to do in general, and then I'm going to make a couple of points on particularly how we might help the global discussion, which I think we were asked to speak to. So the 4 things I'll say is that many of you have no doubt seen that there are many high-level ethics principles that have been published. And I'm going to suggest that in order to go beyond those, we really need to start looking at very specific context settings, because we often hear words which are very encouraging. They sound very good, words like transparency and fairness. But I think that in order to make progress, we really need to start to get a bit more specific about what those words mean in context and having to deal with inevitable dependencies and trade-offs which occur. And a bit more specifically, I'll say 3 things I think we should try to do when looking at particular contexts. One, this links well to Gina's comments and some of the things other people have said. I think we really need to listen very broadly and carefully to users, practitioners, and stakeholder groups to really understand in context what is it that they're concerned about and worried about. Loosely speaking, what is it that we need to try to build into our systems? What are the requirements that we really want? Number 2, we then need to do deep technical work to try to build in whatever those requirements are. That's where I spend most of my time. But first, we need to understand what is it that's needed before we can try to build it in. Then 3, this connects closely with Natalia's work. We need to work closely with policymakers, regulators, and other folks in that space to ensure that whatever the things are that we need to be able reliably to monitor and enforce those. So I suggest that's a general framework for how we can try to move forward. And I'm going to make just 2 quick points on ways that I think we can try to help with global discussions. The first is that I think it's really important for us to learn from and with our international partners, links to Maria's comments. Different people may have slightly different value systems, and I think that's okay. We don't want to impose what we think is right necessarily on everybody. And I think different people developing slightly different governance environments can actually be useful. We should keep talking. We should try to learn from and with everybody so that we can try to move forward in the best way possible. And the very last point I'll make, I know we want to get into the discussion. The last point I'll make is that all these things really require very broad participation. We need to hear diverse voices, as many people have said, to understand what people's concerns are. But we also really need a lot of diverse voices and skills to be involved in this, to work together to try to make progress. We need technical skills, social sciences, cognitive science, law, policy, economics, and many other areas. So there's a lot of work to do. And one message I'd like to get out is please get involved. We need more help. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Adrian. Really appreciate these comments, the starting remarks. I have a set of questions that I prepared, but I think we won't have time to go through all of them. But maybe one thing that I want to ask everyone is about the last point you made, Adrian. We have got some, even in this panel, we have got Mariana from private sector, we have got Menderoo Center, I mean, a social scientist, if I'm right. We have got a computer scientist, and we have got Turing Institute on the other side joining us. And if we are trying to make this really truly academic policy, industry as well collaboration in this space, but the interests are so diverse and the incentives are so different. The methodologies are so different. Even if we were able to bring all these people in one room, which what we have tried to do today, the conversations often remain a bit high level, and we are not able to really get this truly transdisciplinary ways of working or cross-sector practices that really speaks to everyone's interests in the right way, everyone's incentives in the right way. How do you think we can basically, what do you think we can do in this space? What is the solution there? It might be a bit too big, but I think this is the burning part for me, to get this conversation right, design this whole environment in the right way so that we can get really all contributions in a proper way. Anyone wants to take that?
Are we able to be heard online as well? Great. So I think on one level you're right, and on the other level we've already got great models for where we see those collaborations. So again, I want to point to my colleagues at CSaP at Cambridge, the Center for Science and Policy, who have created an ongoing and sustained set of conversations that bring policymakers into spaces to help them think more deeply through their practices of what they're seeing on a daily basis. I would say from my center, what we've done is, we have 4 really broad principles, right? Trust in society, what does that mean? Expanding public knowledge and participation about technology and democracy, again, what does that mean? That's very broad. Future of work, oh my goodness, you could have multiple research centers just on that. And then the impact of digital technologies on climate and the environment. What we've done is drill down in each of those to find really concrete ways that we can work together with a whole host of partners. And sometimes that means we have really hard and tough conversations about who we invite at that table. But I think that when we do, and from our experience, you can see that there are absolute needs in industry for people to take a step back from the daily problem, the daily programmatic work, the daily pragmatic work of helping companies to think about some of those higher order issues. When you see in government, they often need a space that the parliamentary cameras are turned off, and they need to be able to kind of think through what they're doing. And that's what academic research can do. That's what academic convenings can do. So do I think that we are going to get there just through being able to do conversations like this? No, but I think this is absolutely the first step in helping people think through what are some of those blue sky big ideas that we can concretely then put into action. But we usually have to drill down to get into more specific concrete context to do that.
There is an excellent question that made me reflect for quite a while. While I'm probably one of the very few from traditional industry players that I'm engaging in industry as the way I engage it, I'm not even a policy person. And speaking with public policy and with ethicists in companies where they exist, we realize that actually there isn't capacity within organizations, the majority of organizations, not just tech industry, on those 2 types of role, public policy and ethics. And if they exist, they operate in silo from each other, even in the technology companies. There is a little bit of a trend, and I'm not going to name the company that are working towards that, to bring them together. But it's very, very early stages. So how can we through the research that's conducted in academia, support organizations to prioritize allocating budget for those to position public policy and ethics, for them to work together, to be able to be exposed to the types of dialogue and conversation and participation that happens, and being able to bring it in and decide how to act on it. Until we have those roles internally in those organizations, we won't be able to progress, because the speed with the adoption of technology happens is phenomenal, is only going to increase. If before the pandemic, many of our clients will not really prioritize digital transformation, especially in legacy industries, we can see now an acceleration to cloud migration, which will only fast forward and power up the adoption of technologies like AI. And with that, the risk for a lot of the actions and decisions to be automated without proper consideration. Already my colleagues and our customers talk about AI becoming a software engineering problem and being standardized, being automated. A lot of the topics around fairness and explainability become feature to cloud platforms. Therefore, how can we prevent, before we go into automate everything, to have those conversations, and who can carry those conversations inside those organizations? And keep in mind, again and again, I'm going to say it, every company is a tech companies, because technology is being developed in banks, in retail, is not just only acquired from the big tech or small tech companies. So we need to be able to look beyond technology industry in everyone who produces tech and how they produce tech, and bring them to the table in a way that they feel they need to be there. At the moment, there's no urgency. Why would they participate? They are coming, they're providing a bit of input, policy and regulation, but not as intentional as should be.
Thanks very much. Adrian?
Thanks very much. I just add to those great points. First, I support Gina's shout out to Center for Science and Policy. Also, of course, her Menderoo Center is doing great work, and Maria's work at PwC is really a great example to show how industry can get involved and work across disciplines. I'll mention a few other organizations doing really, really great things in this space. In the UK, there's the David Pym Centre for the Future of Intelligence, which I'm involved with, the Ada Lovelace Institute, the Oxford Internet Institute, Shannon Valler and colleagues at the Edinburgh Futures Institute are all doing great things. But like we've heard, it's not just academic engagement. It's really important also to involve industry and third sector and policymakers. I want to give a shout out also, Zeynep, to your work with others in starting the Data and Policy Conference and Journal. We need more efforts like that. We need to be coming together more. And one thing that I would really emphasize, tying to my earlier comments, is that I think to make concrete progress, it would be really helpful to focus on some specific domains so we can really get into the detail. And that naturally draws people together, because everyone really cares when you're talking about a very concrete setting that actually affects their lives. Thanks.
Listening to all of that threw a couple of thoughts into my mind, perhaps rather randomly. The first one is that something said by Rear Admiral Grace Hopper of the United States Navy some years ago, who said, before the Second World War, life was simple. Then we got systems. And we've been struggling with systems ever since. And that led me on to think, well, maybe it's an aspiration for AI to become like a software engineering discipline, but if only software engineering could become an engineering discipline. I mean, that would be a great step forward. I mean, it's a huge problem already. So great ambition, but maybe not so deliverable at this point. Yeah, then thinking about how you go about making an engineering discipline out of things is an interesting question. And again, when life was simple, it was a simple thing to do. If you were some kind of clever mathematician and you went out and looked at some problem in the world, and how do you explain what materials are needed to build a bridge so it doesn't blow down in the wind, or heaven forbid, how do you build an algorithm to predict how a virus is going to spread or something? That was easy, right? It was all very easy when the clever mathematician went and looked at the problem and was able to ascertain what the model that he was going to build had to look like. the world is much, much more complex than that these days. And it's easy to talk about getting people together and talking about building a shared understanding of a problem, even if it's a very specific domain. And that's a great ambition, but even then it's tough. And it's tough because people speak very different languages. So what one needs to establish is a way of not merely sharing an understanding of a problem, because actually it won't really be shared, it'll be expressed in lots of different languages. What one has to have is a way of translating those languages in ways that everybody can understand. So, I mean, there's actually a lot of methodological work going on these days around what is the philosophy and methodology of modeling, right? And that's what we're talking about here. We're building models of everything. And that has to require not only the simple old-fashioned, mathematical modeling cycle where you observe something, you build a model, you see what the model does, you interpret what that model does back in the real world, and then you refine that until you're happy with it, and then magically you have something which gives you the right answer. That's no good anymore, because it doesn't address the problem of how the people who have critical knowledge of different aspects of that problem interact with one another, and that's a translation problem. It's not enough just to share, you have to translate.
Okay, thanks so much. Well, we started a bit late, so I'll allow another 5 minutes to go for this session to go, basically. And I want to check if there are questions in the floor. Okay, Jeff, right?
Yes. Thank you, Zeynep. So I wanted to go back actually to what you had said earlier during your presentation, where you actually referred to securities exchanges. Now, I know that David referred to governance of derivatives, financial derivatives, but you mentioned securities exchanges and high-frequency trading. And I wanted to ask the question about whether we can think of this question of algorithmic governance as really being governance. Algorithmic governance is governance. And in the context of high-frequency trading or securities trading, generally, we have oversight over markets or an exchange network. So, for example, MiFID in Europe or NMS in the US, where we actually have a regulator that's overseeing a decentralized system that is completely operated by private sector entities. So my question is, can we imagine using this as a model for how we can envision proper governance of decentralized systems where there is some kind of regulatory oversight, but that ultimately the systems are built by the private sector and implementing the rules? Thank you.
Panel, can you repeat the question? Because I don't think they'll be able to hear on Zoom.
Okay, it's too big for me to repeat, but we can. Okay, so it's about basically the governance of distributed mechanisms and how we can, whether we can use that as a model for the algorithmic governance, well, not algorithmic governance, but governance as a whole.
Securities exchanges in particular.
Okay, securities exchanges in particular. Sorry, I can't rephrase the question because the way that I mentioned high-frequency trading was just as something that's the closest thing to governance by algorithm that we know of currently, that I'm aware of at least. I think the distributed, when you're talking the distributed machine, distributed argument is also something that's going around federated machine learning systems and how we can maybe also organize learning in that way as well. So I don't know the basically answer. I think it's worth a try. We should really put all options and talk about these. I think there's the ambition. I also mentioned the distributed ledger in a previous slide about people thinking about governance, yes, in a distributed peer-to-peer way. So not really thinking about too much centralization around it. Again, ambitious, but I don't have good answers. So I will ask my panelists whether they have got anything to say on this issue.
In economics, in security economics in particular, there is beginning to be a theory of resilience in ecosystems. And the idea is, one has the concept of a steward of the ecosystem, which is essentially the regulator, right? And you can establish results to the effect that there are limits to the effectiveness of the steward, right? So there are some shocks to the system that are so big that the system never recovers whatever the steward does. On the other hand, within limits, the steward can be extremely effective and make a big difference, and both to the resilience and the overall sustainability of the ecosystem. So, yeah, it's a good model, provided you don't break it too hard, Yeah.
Okay, I see Adrian's hand up. Adrian.
Thanks. I just add that I think it's a really good question. The audience member is exactly right that this is perhaps the first system we can see that have really high stakes decisions taking place at high speed by algorithms with monitoring, which to some extent is algorithmic. I think it is a good model. For us to think about issues. It's not going to be the same setup which applies everywhere, of course, but trying to think through what rules do we want our systems to have in specific domains in order that everyone's on a level playing field and in order that we'll get results which will benefit society broadly. It's a good example. It's not a perfect example, but it's one we can start from. I just note that there are good causes for hope from that because most of the time the markets function really well and that can be really useful for society. But it's also a bit sobering because these are complex systems with lots of interacting agents, and it's very tricky to predict exactly what's going to happen. And we have seen and probably will continue to see from time to time flash crashes. It's a bit worrying. It's not exactly clear how we should try, if we should try to avoid that. It's not entirely clear to what extent there are externalities, like whether particularly well-equipped high-frequency operators are jumping ahead of retail. Is that happening? Is it not? Should we have speed bumps or not? There are big questions where the answers are unclear, and I think that will be also true in other settings.
Thank you. I think with that, maybe really sorry for rushing into a short panel. The idea was to really keep it more active and moving, so we try to make panel times shorter than what it is usually done, how it is usually done. So thank you very much for your contributions. It's great to have you in this panel. So thanks a lot. And may I ask for a good applause for my speakers.